What's your best advice for veterans listening right now who are frustrated because they feel VA ignored their evidence?
Well, my best advice is to get help. And keep in mind, there are lots of levels of help out there. There are veteran service officers who have a lot of experience with these claims. There are agents and attorneys who have experience with these claims. And what I always tell people is it really depends on the level of complexity. I often use the example of someone who was in an incident where there was an IED that exploded and took off half their foot. The VA can see that injury. They won't have any trouble rating that. They see it, they understand it, they can rate it. But if in the same incident, you're in the same Humvee where this person was injured, and you were sitting in the furthest corner in the back and banged your head off the side and now have a TBI, then it's harder for VA to see that and understand it. If you can still walk and talk, they're not going to be able to understand the severity of the problem. They might not even recognize that you have a problem. So I think of it as requiring higher levels of expertise depending on the level of complexity of the claim.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system, or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Alexandra Jackson, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson MacNichol. He has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. Today's show is about dealing with when you have evidence and we're still denied. So, let's start with the obvious. Why does VA sometimes deny a claim even when the evidence seems pretty solid?
Well, think of the VA in this context as being like an insurance adjuster. When you go to make an insurance claim, the insurance company wants certain specific information. The fact that you have a lot of information may not mean that you have the information that they think they need.
Fair enough. What do you think are the most common reasons that evidence gets overlooked or discounted by VAs? Because it doesn't tick those specific boxes? Or is it the source? Or
Well, it can be all those things. I mean, the two kind of general categories where VA typically finds that the evidence is not sufficient to convince them are evidence about the facts of what happened in the service, or medical evidence connecting the whatever happened in the service, whether it's an incident or illness or whatever, exposure, with the current medical condition. It's usually one of those two things where VA says you don't have enough evidence. Sometimes both, but usually at least one of those.
How should veterans go about reading their denial letters to try and figure out what they can do to fix it?
Read them with care. The VA actually, most of the time, will give you a roadmap. They'll tell you what it is that they're not convinced you've proven. So in the current system, the AMA, which came in February of 2019, the VA is supposed to tell you what facts they found that were favorable. So, for example, they might tell you that they concede that you have diabetes, but they might also tell you that they don't concede that you were at a place where you were exposed to Agent Orange, and so they're not willing to agree that your diabetes should be service connected.
Okay. And if you're looking at the decision, They call those what? Findings in your favor, positive
Fa-
findings?
favorable findings of fact. Yep.
Okay. So a veteran should be looking for those
Yep.
and then read to see which of those, 3 elements the VA still thinks they're missing.
That's right, because remember, it's always the same 3 elements. There has to be something that happened in service, there has to be a current medical condition, and there has to be a medical opinion saying it's at least as likely as not that A is related to B.
Okay. And when somebody is denied, what are their options for an appeal?
Well, there are technically 3 options for going forward. One is what's called higher level review. That just means that you ask someone in the VA rating system who has more experience to look at the claim that's been denied, but it's on exactly the same evidence. Second option is what's called a supplemental claim. In a supplemental claim, 2 things are important. One, you can submit new evidence, which you cannot do in a higher level review. And 2, as long as you file within a year, it preserves the original effective date. You don't lose that date. And the third option is the traditional appeal. That would be to the Board of Veterans' Appeals in Washington. And that, again, can be broken into some different parts. There are technically 3 different lanes, depending on what you want to do about evidence and whether you want a hearing and so on.
So you've really got 5 different appeal options,
Yep.
2 at the regional office and 3 at the board.
That's right.
Okay. And
If you want to get really technical, there's a 6th, which is clear and unmistakable error, but
that's not really an appeal, though, and it's
No,
not
that-
really a claim either. It's
It's-
just a problem.
that's one way to put it, yes.
Fun fact, clear and unmistakable error has no real good way to actually start a process for that. So that's why we say it's a problem, because it often gets stuck in processing. Do not use that as your starting point.
If you can possibly avoid it.
Yeah, if you can at all avoid it, you are much better off with a new claim or an appeal rather than trying to put in for clear and unmistakable error. The standard is also very high, so it's not a good choice generally. What does a veteran want to look at to decide which appeal path is best for them?
Well, I think it's fairly straightforward. If there's a really, really obvious error, then higher level review may work. And the problem with higher level review, think this through with me, what you're doing is you're going back to the same people with the same evidence and saying, I think you got this wrong, please look at it again. The odds of them changing their minds are quite low. So you have to have a really, really obvious error. I mean, VA raters are human, they make mistakes, and sometimes they make really obvious mistakes. And if you point out a really obvious mistake, they'll generally do their best to fix it. But higher level review as an overall approach, in my experience, rarely works.
So you want something either pretty minor or pretty straightforward. So like they gave you an effective date, but you had an intent to file within the year before that claim and they missed it.
Yep.
Or, bilateral hearing loss, you look at the chart and the numbers say you should be at a different one. Something really mechanical.
Yep. Something really obvious and mechanical. That's what you need for HLR. And unfortunately, a lot of veterans come to us with the thought in their head that I don't understand why VA turned me down. My case is so obvious. I've got all this evidence. And they simply can't conceptualize that VA is either not being shown a particular thing that they need to be shown, or that the evidence that is there is not in a convincing format that leads them to believe it. So, for example, if someone has a letter from their doctor that says, I think Jones's left shoulder problem is related to his service, and they send you to a C&P exam, and the C&P doctor says, gee, I don't see how this could be related to service. 99 times out of 100, the VA is going to go with their C&P exam and say, oh, you lose, not related to service. And so the more clear and understandable way that a doctor can explain in medical detail why your left shoulder problem is actually related to this thing that happened in service, the better you'll do.
Okay. And what is usually the most persuasive evidence on appeal when the initial evidence wasn't enough?
Well, it depends on whether it's factual or medical. What we've found is that most of the time, the cases that come to us are ones where the VA is not convinced of the medical connection between the current problem and what happened in service. And so we end up needing to get a truly expert opinion, medical opinion, explaining in careful medical detail how what happened in service led to the current condition. That's easily 90% of the cases we see.
And if the CMP exam being unfavorable was kind of the big factor, is a medical opinion how you deal with that also, or are there other ways?
Well, usually it's a medical opinion. Sometimes the CMP examiner will just plain get the facts wrong. We've seen that. And in that case, you can go back and lay out what the correct facts are and support them, and how the VA examiner misunderstood some critical point. That can happen, but most of the time, it's just about you've got a VA contract examiner who is not an expert in this particular area of medicine, is doing this quickly, doesn't have time to really study the file, and just comes to a conclusion that a true expert who takes the time and really digs into the facts can demonstrate is wrong. And that's the solution in those cases.
Can lay statements from family or coworkers ever tip the scales for an appeal?
I think they can. I think they can. One of the things that VA often will say is that, well, this incident happened in service, but it happened years ago. We think you got better and just hurt yourself again, and it's not our problem. And, lay statements from spouses in particular are very effective, but family members in general, or anyone who is around the veteran a lot and has been for a long time, can submit a statement saying, I knew Jones before he went in the service, and when he came back from the service, he'd pick up something and he'd complain about how his back hurt, and that's been going on for years and seems to be getting worse. And if you couple that with a good medical report, it may well convince the VA that, yes, this goes back to when the person fell off the back of a tank or was holding something heavy and somebody dropped the other end and they got all the force, those kind of typical incidents that happen.
Yeah, and stuff that's never going to get written up in any sort of report anywhere.
That's it.
I dropped something is not a winner as far as workplace safety reports goes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And more than that, just those kinds of things that happen day to day in the military tend not to get reported. They're just part of kind of everyday life. And often the person who's injured doesn't appreciate the significance or severity of the injury. And it's not until years later, as things get worse and worse, that they finally recognize that, this is getting pretty bad. I got to do something about it. And they end up making a claim.
Yeah, as you've discussed before, people are usually at their physical peak, and so they can tend to compensate for whatever the injury is for a while.
Keep in mind, most people go into the service in their late teens or early 20s, and that tends to be when they're at their strongest and healthiest.
Yep. And how does an attorney approach a case where the VA denied a claim despite strong evidence?
Well, you have to go back and look at what was the reason for the denial. It's simply taking the time to do what we've been talking about. Look at what does the VA concede? What favorable findings did they make? Where's the hole? What is it that they're not making the connection between what happened in service and the current problem? Is it a fact issue? Is it that the VA is saying, there's no record you fell off the back of this tank? Or is the VA saying, well, this one-line letter from your doctor saying that your current back problem is related to falling off the tank in service is less persuasive than our full-page report from the CMP examiner who says, I don't see how that could have caused this.
What do you tell veterans who are feeling like everything is stacked against them in the process? How do you keep folks motivated when it just feels like they're up against insurmountable odds?
That's always a challenge. The hardest thing, I think, in practicing VA law is helping people to stick with these claims in the face of denials and sometimes multiple repeated denials. But I think all you can do is to say, number one, I've looked at this claim and I think it has merit. And number two, we will move this claim forward for you. We will make sure your appeals are filed on time. We will get the supporting evidence. We will work with you to get statements and to learn about people who can give us information to support your claim. And let us worry about it. Don't stress about it. Don't think about it.
Put it out of mind.
Yep, let us be the ones to carry the ball. And mostly that works. Sadly, there are some people for whom just having the claim going forward is too stressful and they ultimately drop it. And that's just sad, but it happens.
What's your best advice for veterans listening right now who are frustrated because they feel VA ignored their evidence?
Well, my best advice is to get help. And keep in mind, there are lots of levels of help out there. There are veteran service officers who have a lot of experience with these claims. There are agents and attorneys who have experience with these claims. And what I always tell people is it really depends on the level of complexity. I often use the example of someone who was in an incident where there was an IED that exploded and took off half their foot. The VA can see that injury. They won't have any trouble rating that. They see it, they understand it, they can rate it. But if in the same incident, you're in the same Humvee where this person was injured, and you were sitting in the furthest corner in the back and banged your head off the side and now have a TBI, then it's harder for VA to see that and understand it. If you can still walk and talk, they're not going to be able to understand the severity of the problem. They might not even recognize that you have a problem. So I think of it as requiring higher levels of expertise depending on the level of complexity of the claim.
And are there situations where it makes sense to start a new claim instead of appealing a denial?
There are. I really feel like a lot of veterans get bad advice to reapply rather than to appeal many times and lose out on a lot of back benefits they could have had. But the critical time, it seems to me, when you should reapply if you have been denied and you don't have any new evidence so you can't file a supplemental claim, is you want to reapply if you desperately have to have money right now. Your chances of winning on reapplication are not good, but it is the one thing that will get you the fastest possible result.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to tell our listeners on the sort of evidence?
Yeah, there is. I have never had a veteran come to me who said, gee, I understand why the VA turned my claim down. I don't really have much evidence. I've never had that conversation. The conversation I typically have is, I can't understand why these guys turned down my claim. I have all this evidence. It's so obvious. They should have granted it. And, I've had that conversation a million times. But what I always tell people is there are two things that are required to win a VA claim. One is patience, one is persistence. If you will be patient and persistent and work with someone who understands the system, there is a very high probability that you will win your claim.
All right. Well, that's all we have time for today, but thank you for joining us as we discussed basically evidence in the VA system and VA appeals process.
And please join us next week.
We'll hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.